fire screamed before he did. Sparks leapt like dying stars, swallowing the air in molten rage as iron met iron, each strike echoing through the night like a heartbeat of something greater, something chained yet unbroken. They said freedom had a sound. But for Elias, a slave whose hands forged the very symbol of America's liberty, freedom had a weight. It was heavy, hot. It burned his palms and seared his soul. And though the bell he cast would one day hang as a monument to independence, it would never ring for him. They called him Elias, though that was not the name his mother gave him. That name had been lost somewhere on the dark waves of the Atlantic, traded for a mark, a brand, and the sound of a whip slicing air. In the spring of 1752, Elias stood at the heart of the foundry in Philadelphia, a place where dreams of liberty were melted down beside the screams of the enslaved. The foundry of Whitechapel had crossed the ocean's edge, its bell mold sent from London, and its orders carried the name of a promise. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Those were the words that would later be etched upon the Liberty Bell. Words that meant everything to the men who owned him, and nothing to the man who made it. Elias had learned the trade from an old blacksmith named Cato, a man whose skin was as scarred as the anvils he beat. Steel remembers pain, Cato once told him. So do men, but when you shape it right, both can hold beauty. That sentence lived inside Elias long after Cato's heart gave out one summer night beside the furnace. From then on, the forge became Elias's world. His body belonged to his master, but his fire, his rhythm, his art, those belonged to no one. And in the silence of the night, when the overseer's eyes were elsewhere, he would whisper to the flames like they were a god who still listened. The year was heavy with unrest. Rumors whispered through taverns and alleyways. The colonies were growing restless. Men in powdered wigs and waistcoats spoke of liberty, of rights, and of freedom from tyranny. They wrote pamphlets and speeches, their voices rising against a distant king. But inside the foundries, inside the plantations, inside the backs of wagons carrying chained men and women, that same word, freedom, tasted different. It wasn't a speech. It was a hunger. And for Elias, it was the quiet pulsing question that burned with every strike of his hammer. The order came one morning wrapped in wax-sealed parchment. A great bell was to be cast for the new State House of Pennsylvania. It would stand as a symbol of liberty and justice for all. Elias's master, Richard Niles, a cruel man with hands softer than a child's, took the contract proudly. But it was Elias who would do the work, every pour, every mold, every strike. The bell would be his child, though the world would never know his name. For days, the forge bled light into the night sky. Men worked until their backs broke, until their skin blistered from the heat. The mold was enormous, a creature of clay and sand shaped to perfection. Elias knew its curves like he knew the scars on his wrists. He spoke to it under his breath as though speaking to a sleeping soul. "You will ring for them," he whispered, "but maybe, just maybe, you'll sing for me too." But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. When the day came to pour the molten metal, a crack tore through the mold's edge. A flaw, small but deadly. The first bell was born broken. The overseer's whip sang through the air before Elias could explain. Blood hit the floor beside copper dust. "You ruined it," Niles spat. "You ruined liberty itself." For nights, Elias lay awake listening to the hammering outside, as others were called to repair what his mistake had broken. But in his heart he knew the truth. The bell was cracked before the fire ever touched it. Because liberty, as they preached it, had been cracked from the beginning. Weeks later, Elias was forced to begin again. This time his hands trembled, not from fear but from something deeper, defiance. Every strike was a whisper of rebellion. Every molten pour was a prayer. He mixed the metal differently this time, a secret ratio of copper, tin, and tears, not out of science, but instinct. He wanted this bell to live, to carry a voice that the world could never silence. The nights grew longer, the heat unbearable, but Elias's eyes burned with purpose. Somewhere between the hammer's song and the fire's roar, he felt something awakening inside him. Then came the morning of the final pour. The air was heavy, the sky dim and gray as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The furnace doors opened, flooding the workshop with firelight that painted the walls like a battlefield. The metal poured like a river of suns. Elias stood there, his silhouette trembling against the blaze as though his soul were merging with the metal. Hours later, as the mold cooled, the sound of cracking clay filled the air. The new bell was born, heavier, smoother, deeper. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew. This one was different. When the officials came to inspect it, they marveled at the craftsmanship. They praised Niles for his skill, his men, his contribution to the cause of freedom. Elias stood in the background, his face hidden in the smoke. But as they read the inscription, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," Elias's jaw tightened. He wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream. All the inhabitants? He thought. Then why do I still wear chains? That night, after the others left, Elias stayed behind. He walked to the bell, still cooling under the moonlight. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the flicker of the dying forge. He placed his hand against it, and for a moment, it felt alive. "You belong to them," he whispered, "but your voice, that's mine." And in that moment, he did something no one would ever know. With a small chisel and a steady hand, Elias carved 3 faint letters on the inside lip of the bell, so small they would never be seen by the eye, but known to the spirit. ESL, Elias Slave Liberty. His name, his truth, his rebellion. Days later, the bell was hoisted into place at the Pennsylvania State House. The city gathered to hear it ring for the first time. Elias stood among the crowd, hidden beneath the shadow of a nearby cart, watching as men in fine coats pulled the rope. The bell swung, once, twice. Then a deep sound rolled through the air like thunder wrapped in sorrow. People cheered. Flags waved. And for a fleeting second, Elias smiled. But then he heard it. A hollow tremor, a flaw deep within the metal. It was as though the bell itself refused to celebrate a freedom it did not know. Over time, the bell cracked again, a thin line splitting its surface, silencing its voice. The people mourned the flaw, called it imperfection, and stored it away. But Elias, he called it justice, because maybe liberty was never meant to ring without breaking first. Years later, when whispers of revolution turned into gunfire, and men bled for the very freedom they once preached about, Elias had vanished from the records. Some said he escaped north, others said he died in the forge. But among the enslaved, a story passed in secret about a man who forged the bell that never rang, and carved his name inside the heart of liberty itself. And when, decades later, abolitionists took that silent bell as their symbol of freedom, carrying it from town to town as a voice for the voiceless, they never knew whose hands had truly made it. But maybe, in some way, Elias finally spoke, not through sound, but silence. Because sometimes, the loudest voices are the ones the world tried to silence first. The bell that never rang gathered dust in the silence of the State House. Years passed. Seasons turned. The crack that silenced it grew darker with every storm, like a scar time refused to heal. Tourists came and went. Politicians pointed at it, spoke of its symbolism, and moved on. But beneath all their speeches and ceremony, the truth was buried, a truth cast in fire and blood, molded by the hands of a man they had chosen to forget. Elias was gone, or so the record said. Yet in the quiet corners of Philadelphia, in the alleys where the scent of iron still lingered, his name lived like a rumor. They said a blacksmith had escaped one night after the bell cracked, slipping through the fog down by the Delaware River. They said he'd left behind nothing but ashes and the faint mark of his initials carved into a wooden beam, ESL. But no one knew where he went, not the masters, not the watchmen, not the men who once owned him. The truth was this: Elias didn't die. Not yet. He had found his way north, guided by whispers and the kindness of those who risked everything to help men like him. Through swamps and forests, through the hunger and the cold, he followed a path known only to the desperate, the path that would later be called the Underground Railroad. There was no iron, no steam, no tracks, just hearts willing to hide another beating heart. One night, as snow fell over the Delaware, Elias crossed the frozen water, each step cracking ice beneath his feet like the ghost of the bell he had made. By the time he reached the other side, his chains were gone, but the marks they left never would be. Freedom, he learned, wasn't a sunrise. It was a long walk through darkness. He found work in a small town in Pennsylvania, at the edge of a forest where a blacksmith named Jonah kept his forge. Jonah was an old Quaker with eyes that carried both peace and pain. The kind of man who didn't ask questions but saw the answers in the scars of others. "You've got the hands of a man who's seen fire," Jonah told him on the first day. Elias just nodded. He never spoke much. Words had always been a luxury of free men. Under Jonah's quiet guidance, Elias found a strange kind of peace. The hammer felt different now, lighter, truer. He no longer forged for masters or overseers. He forged for himself, for survival, for hope. He made horseshoes, farm tools, locks, and chains, though he never liked making those. And every time metal met fire, he felt that same old rhythm returning, that heartbeat of resistance. One night, while mending a wagon wheel, Elias overheard two men speaking outside the forge. They spoke in low, urgent voices about war, about rebellion, about men gathering in Boston and Concord, about something greater than talk this time. "They're calling it a revolution," one said. "Freedom for all men under God." Elias's hands froze mid-strike. He had heard those words before, freedom for all men, and he wondered if they meant it this time. But the truth was bitter. When war finally came, it wasn't his war to fight. Black men were still seen as property, tools, or shadows. Some masters sent their slaves to fight in their place. Others promised freedom to those who took up arms. Most promises were lies. Elias had no country to fight for, only a hope he still couldn't name. Still, he couldn't ignore the sound of hammers ringing again. Not bells this time, but muskets, cannons, and courage. And he couldn't ignore the whispers that reached even the quiet towns. The revolution had begun. Months later, in 776, Elias stood on a hill overlooking a field where men trained in ragged uniforms, their breath clouding the cold air. He'd come to fix weapons, sharpen blades, repair the broken. The army needed every skilled hand, and though they never asked his name, they took his work. Sometimes, at night, soldiers gathered around his forge, their faces lit by flame, listening as he shaped metal that might one day end lives. But to Elias, each sword, each bullet mold, was more than war. It was balance. If his hands had once forged the bell of false liberty, perhaps now they could shape something closer to truth. It was during those nights that Elias met a young soldier named Nathaniel Reeves, a boy barely 20, with ink-stained fingers and a poet's heart. Nathaniel came from Philadelphia and had seen the bell once as a child. "They said it cracked because of God's will," he told Elias one evening. "Because liberty can't be contained." Elias smirked. "Or maybe," he said quietly, "because liberty was never whole to begin with." The boy stared at him, puzzled. "You sound like you knew that bell," Nathaniel said. Elias looked away. The firelight caught the reflection of his eyes, two molten embers burning through time. "Maybe I did," he murmured. As battles raged and winter crept in, Elias followed the army north. He saw men freeze, starve, and die. All for a freedom they said was for everyone, though half the campfires still burned under the shadow of chains. Once, after a long march, he stood in a ruined village where homes had been burned to ash. The snow was red, the silence heavy. He thought of the bell again. Silent, cracked, yet still standing. Maybe that's what freedom was, he thought. Not perfect, not whole, but still refusing to fall. Then came the night of Valley Forge. The cold was merciless. Men wrapped their feet in rags, their breath fogging the air like smoke from invisible forges. Elias worked tirelessly, repairing muskets, shaping nails, fixing broken wheels. Nathaniel, now frail and coughing blood, sat beside him near the fire. "You ever think," Nathaniel whispered, "that maybe liberty ain't something you find, but something you build?" Elias paused, the hammer frozen mid-swing. "That's all I've ever done," he said softly. "Build it for others." Nathaniel smiled weakly. "Then one day, maybe it'll build itself for you." The boy didn't live to see that day. When spring returned and the revolution roared louder, Elias buried Nathaniel beneath a tree overlooking the camp. No flag, no marker, just a piece of iron shaped into a small bell he placed at the grave's head. For you, he whispered, and for every man who never got to hear the real sound of liberty. Years passed. The war ended. The United States of America was born, a nation that spoke of freedom while millions still wore chains. The irony was a cruel echo of the bell Elias once forged. Yet even as history marched forward, that silent bell refused to be forgotten. It became a relic, a symbol, a ghost that haunted every speech and proclamation that dared to use the word freedom. Elias, now older, found himself living in the outskirts of New York, working as a craftsman. His hair had turned silver at the edges, his hands still calloused, but steady. He had taken a new name, Elijah Smith, though deep down he was still Elias, the man who forged the sound of a nation. He avoided questions, avoided crowds. But one day, a group of abolitionists came to his town, carrying pamphlets and passion. They spoke of equality, of a new dawn, of ending slavery once and for all. And in their hands, Elias saw something that made his breath catch. A sketch of the Liberty Bell, cracked and solemn, with the words, "Proclaim Liberty." He stared at it for a long time. "You know," one of the young men said, "they say that crack was a flaw in the metal, but I think it was a message. Maybe liberty isn't broken. Maybe it's waiting for us to fix it." Elias said nothing. His throat tightened. That night, he took out a small piece of copper he'd kept hidden for years, a remnant of the original pour. He placed it in the fire one last time, watching it glow, watching it remember. The next morning, he walked to the abolitionist meeting house. He carried a small object wrapped in cloth. "This," he said quietly, placing it on the table, "belongs to liberty more than any speech ever will." Inside the cloth was a small bell, perfectly forged, polished, uncracked. On its inner lip were 3 faint letters, E.S.L. The men looked at it in awe. "Did you make this?" one asked. Elias smiled faintly. "A long time ago, I made a bell that couldn't ring. Maybe this one can." And with that, he left, disappearing into history once again, leaving behind only the firelight and the echo of a sound no one had yet heard. Years later, when slavery finally ended, that small bell resurfaced, found in an attic by a preacher in Philadelphia. It was worn but whole, and when he struck it lightly with a wooden mallet, it gave off a soft, trembling chime. Not loud, not proud, but true. The preacher smiled and said, "Maybe liberty was never meant to shout. Maybe it was meant to whisper, until everyone heard." And somewhere, perhaps far beyond time, the spirit of Elias, the man who forged liberty, finally smiled. Time moves like rust, slow, silent, and merciless. The year was 1837, and Philadelphia had changed. The streets were wider, the buildings taller, and the air thicker with the smell of coal and industry. But beneath all that progress, the old wounds still throbbed. The Liberty Bell, once forgotten in the corner of the State House, now stood as a national relic, its crack a mystery, its silence a sermon. People came to see it from across the states, pointing at the fracture like pilgrims staring at a holy scar. And yet, none of them knew who it shaped. None of them knew about the man whose sweat and blood still slept inside its metal. None of them had heard the whispers passed from forge to forge, about a slave who once carved his name into the soul of liberty itself. In a narrow street just outside Independence Hall, a young boy named Samuel worked at a print shop. He was 12, the son of a free black woman named Ruth, and every day he delivered newspapers to the men who wore fine coats and spoke loudly of freedom. Samuel's mother had once told him stories about the bell, how it had been forged by hands like theirs, by a man who vanished into legend. "His name was Elias," she said, her voice soft and reverent. "And he gave liberty its voice, even when it refused to speak for him." At first, Samuel thought it was just a story. But one winter morning, while delivering papers near the State House, he wandered inside the hall where the bell was kept. The great iron relic stood before him, massive and solemn, its surface dull under the pale light. He reached out, his small fingers tracing the crack that ran like lightning down its side. For a moment he felt something, a pulse, faint but alive. He leaned closer, whispering, "If you were made by someone like me, why won't you sing?" The guard shooed him away, but the question never left his heart. That night Samuel told his mother what he'd felt. Ruth listened quietly, then went to a small box under her bed and pulled out an old folded parchment. Its edges were browned by time. She handed it to her son. "This was given to me by my father," she said, "and to him by a man who called himself Elijah Smith. They say he once forged a bell that couldn't ring." Samuel unfolded the paper carefully. Inside was a drawing, a sketch of a small bell perfectly round, marked with faint letters, ESL. Beneath it, written in shaky ink, were the words, "The sound of freedom is in the hands that make it." That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. The story his mother told him, about Elias, about the bell, about how the sound of liberty could belong to the enslaved, filled his mind like a dream that refused to fade. He swore then that one day he would make sure everyone knew the truth. Years passed, and the boy became a man. Samuel Carter, now a young journalist and activist, joined the growing movement for abolition. He wrote under a pen name, ESL, the same initials he'd once seen carved on that parchment. His articles appeared in underground newspapers across the North, fierce, poetic, and unflinching. He wrote about freedom not as an ideal, but as a debt unpaid. One night, while covering an anti-slavery rally in Boston, he stood before a crowd and said, "You call the Liberty Bell a symbol of freedom, but it was born in chains. Its maker was a slave. Its silence is his story. Until we remember the hands that forged our liberty, we remain unworthy of its name." The crowd roared. Some cheered, some wept, and somewhere, beyond the veil of time, maybe Elias smiled again. By the 1840s, the Liberty Bell had become more than a monument. It had become a contradiction, a cracked voice that both inspired and accused. Abolitionists began using its image on pamphlets and posters, calling it the bell that would not ring until all are free. It traveled across states on wagons, wrapped in cloth and reverence, its silence a message louder than any sermon. And at every stop, speakers told the story of liberty, but none of them knew the story behind the story. That changed in 1846. Samuel, now in his early 20s, had begun researching the origins of the bell. He searched archives, spoke to foundry workers, and tracked ship records that led back to the old contracts of the Whitechapel Bell Company. One document caught his eye, a record listing enslaved laborers hired under a man named Richard Niles in 1752. Among the names, one was faint, nearly erased, Elias. No surname, no history, just Elias. Samuel's heart pounded. He stayed up all night tracing the paper under candlelight, imagining the man's face, his voice, his fire. "Elias," he whispered, "you were real." Determined to find proof, Samuel traveled to Philadelphia, where the original foundry once stood. The building was long gone, replaced by brick warehouses and coal yards. But an old man named Silas, a retired smith, remembered stories his grandfather told him. "My granddaddy said there was a man, black as night, strong as iron, who made that bell," Silas said. "They said he put his mark inside it, but no one ever saw it. Folks said it was superstition. But my granddaddy, he believed it." Samuel's mind raced. If that mark truly existed, it would change everything. One cold morning, he managed to gain entry to Independence Hall under the guise of a reporter. The guard recognized him from his writings and let him in. Alone with the bell, Samuel lit a small lantern and knelt beside it. The surface was rough, pitted with age. The crack gleamed faintly in the dim light. Slowly he crawled underneath, tracing the inner curve with trembling fingers. And then, there it was, 3 faint letters, nearly invisible, etched deep into the metal's lip. The SL. Samuel froze. His throat tightened. For a moment he could hear it, the hammer's ring, the hiss of molten metal, the rhythm of a slave's heartbeat. He pressed his hand against the letters, whispering, "I found you." Tears blurred his eyes. He stumbled out of the hall, heart racing, lungs shaking. Outside the world was gray with fog, but to him it burned bright as molten fire. That night he wrote an article titled, the hands that forged liberty. It spread like wildfire. Newspapers reprinted it. Preachers quoted it. For the first time, people began to whisper the truth, that maybe liberty wasn't just a word written by statesmen, but something built by the enslaved, beaten into being by those denied its promise. The story caught the attention of abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass, who once stood before a crowd and said, "The bell that rang for freedom was forged by unfree hands." Its silence is not shame, it is justice. For until every man is free, the bell must not sing. The legend of Elias spread, and though many still doubted, others began to believe. The bell became not just a relic, but a mirror, showing America the fracture between its words and its deeds. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Liberty Bell was again placed on display as a symbol of unity. Soldiers marched past it, drums beating, flags flying. Samuel, now an older man, watched from the crowd, remembering that cold night in Independence Hall. "They still don't understand," he murmured. "They still think freedom is sound." By 1865, when the war finally ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the bell was struck again in celebration. It didn't ring. Not truly, but those who listened closely swore they heard something. Not a sound, but a feeling, a vibration deep in the chest. Some said it was the echo of the past. Others said it was the voice of the enslaved finally being heard. Samuel stood among the crowd, tears running down his cheeks. "You're free now," he whispered. "All of you." And so is he. After that day, Samuel disappeared from the public eye. He lived out his remaining years quietly, writing letters and essays about forgotten heroes, men like Elias, women like Ruth, and countless others whose names never reached the history books. When he died in 1892, a small copper bell was found on his bedside table, the same one passed down through his family. On the inside, the faint letters ESL still glimmered under candlelight. Decades later, in 1926, during America's 150th anniversary, the Liberty Bell was displayed again. Thousands came to see it. Cameras flashed. Politicians spoke of freedom and sacrifice. But among the visitors was a small boy, dark-skinned, curious, holding his grandfather's old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "The Slave Who Forged Liberty." He stood before the bell, looking up at the crack, and whispered the same words Elias once did nearly 2 centuries ago. "You belong to them. But your voice, that's ours." The boy smiled. Somewhere, perhaps beyond the veil of time and flame, a hammer struck again, once softly like the heart of history beating. Because the truth never dies. It cools, it rusts, it waits, until someone new remembers to listen. The air in Philadelphia was thick with smoke and the sweet metallic tang of blood. By 1777, the streets had become a battlefield of whispers and fear. British redcoats marched with cold precision through cobblestoned alleys while patriots vanished into shadows, their faith carried only in scraps of parchment and hurried prayers. The Liberty Bell, that hollow symbol, had already been hidden deep beneath the floorboards of a church cellar in Allentown. And somewhere between those secret walls and the chaos outside, Elias still breathed, though barely. He had survived the Revolution's earliest storms, but freedom, true freedom, had slipped through his fingers like molten iron. When the founders spoke of liberty, they never meant him. When the soldiers toasted victory, his name was never on their tongues. Yet still he remained the unseen force behind their ideals, the quiet craftsman who had shaped the sound of a nation, even if that bell would never sing his name. After the war's first wave, Elias was sold again. His new master, a colonel-turned-merchant named Silas Thorne, was a man who had grown fat on war profits. He believed the revolution had been God's way of rewarding the clever. In his workshops, Elias was forced to forge chains, a bitter irony that made his hands tremble each night. The same hands that had once forged liberty now shaped its opposite. Silas, like many men of his station, liked to drink and talk loudly of freedom's triumph. But to Elias, freedom had become a cruel joke, a story white men told to each other in candlelit rooms, while men like him were kept in the dark. And yet he could not let go of the sound. That single imagined note, the one he had never heard from the bell, haunted his sleep. It was the promise of something unfulfilled, something still waiting. By 1781, the war's final sparks were burning out. Elias was sent north with a convoy of supplies bound for the Continental Army. He worked under the pretense of repair, fixing the army's cannons, melting damaged iron into usable parts. But deep down, Elias knew this journey would be his last chance. Somewhere beyond those muddy roads lay a country deciding what freedom meant, and he intended to demand his piece of it. In the dead of night, as the wagons stopped near the Delaware River, Elias slipped away. The air was frozen, his breath visible in silver strands beneath the moon. Behind him, the campfires flickered like small dying suns. He followed the river south toward Philadelphia, the city that had taken everything from him, and yet still called to him like a distant heartbeat. When he reached the city, he found it unrecognizable. British troops had come and gone, leaving rubble and ashes in their wake. The old foundry where the bell had been cast was gone, half burned, half looted. The smell of charred oak and old iron still lingered. But there, in the ruins, Elias found something that stopped him cold, a fragment. A curved sliver of bronze buried beneath soot and debris, marked with the faintest engraving. "Proclaim liberty." He knelt beside it, trembling. His fingertips brushed the edge, and for a moment he imagined the whole bell again, unbroken, gleaming, alive. The people who had stolen his labor would never know the truth, that the sound of their freedom had come from enslaved hands. And even though that bell had never rung in his lifetime, Elias knew it carried his spirit. As the years passed, whispers spread of an old blacksmith who could mend anything, a ghost of the Revolution who roamed between the forges of Pennsylvania. Some said he had a scar shaped like a flame on his palm. Others swore they saw him hammering in silence under the moonlight, as if chasing a sound that only he could hear. In truth, Elias had become both legend and ghost. He no longer sought freedom from men. He sought it in his craft. Wherever he went, he melted broken bells and reformed them into new ones, each smaller than the last, each carrying a different tone. He called them his children of silence. When a minister once asked him why he made bells that never rang, Elias simply replied, "Because one day, one of them will." Decades later, when the Liberty Bell cracked upon its first great toll, few knew the story of the man who had forged it. Crowds gathered to mourn the broken relic, to whisper about fate and divine irony. But perhaps it was not irony at all. Perhaps it was truth. The bell had always been broken from the moment it was cast, because freedom built on chains can never sing in tune. And as the centuries rolled forward, that crack became the symbol itself, not of perfection, but of struggle, of a dream too vast for the world that birthed it. And somewhere in a quiet graveyard beyond Philadelphia's edge, the wind still passes through the trees in a low, resonant hum. If you listen closely, you might almost hear it, the sound of a bell that never rang, but never stopped echoing. The year was 1835. Philadelphia had grown louder, richer, and crueler all at once. The same streets where revolutionaries once whispered of freedom now rang with the hammer of factories, the clatter of horse carriages, and the cries of men selling dreams they'd never earn. But amid the progress and the pride stood one silent thing, the bell. It hung in Independence Hall, unmoved and unhealed, a monument of bronze and hypocrisy. Tourists stared at its wide, jagged crack. Poets wrote of its noble imperfection, and politicians used it to preach. Yet no one remembered the hands that had shaped it, the hands that had bled for its birth, except one old man. He came walking up Chestnut Street one winter evening, his coat torn, his hair white as the snow collecting on his shoulders. His steps were uneven, but his eyes, those eyes, still burned with the blacksmith's fire. He was nearly blind now, but he didn't need sight to find his way. He followed the sound of memory, the hiss of iron, the rhythm of the hammer, the song of creation. It was Elias. He had lived longer than anyone thought he would. He'd drifted through towns, fixed broken bells, and told no one his story. He had seen America change, but not heal. He had watched freedom grow, but not reach him. And now, after half a century of silence, he had returned to see the thing he'd forged, the thing that had stolen his life, his youth, and his name. Inside the hall, the bell rested under a pale beam of moonlight. Dust coated its surface like the weight of time itself. The famous crack split through its body like an old scar that never healed, a wound that refused to close. Elias approached it slowly, his hand trembling as it brushed against the cold bronze. The metal was colder than he remembered, lifeless. Once it had glowed red and alive beneath his hammer. Now it was just a symbol, worshipped by men who'd forgotten its maker. He whispered, "You were never meant to ring for them." His fingers traced the inscription that still glimmered faintly in the dim light. "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." All the inhabitants. The words had mocked him for decades, and yet, standing there, he felt something shift. Not in the bell, but in himself. Maybe liberty wasn't meant to come from the mouths of the powerful. Maybe it was meant to rise slowly, painfully, from the silence of those who had been denied it. He closed his eyes. In his mind, he was back in the forge again, young, strong, sweat running down his arms, the roar of the fire filling the air. The bell glowed before him, liquid light turning solid, the sound of a nation being born from the rhythm of his hammer. Clang. Clang! Clang! He could almost hear it now. The tone he had dreamed of his entire life. Deep, pure, eternal. The sound of truth. The sound that no crack could silence. When the guards found him the next morning, Elias was slumped beside the bell, his head resting gently against its side, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. The morning sun cut through the windows, glinting off the bell's crack and the old man's weathered skin. It was as if time itself had bowed to him, if only for a moment. They buried him in a quiet grave on the outskirts of the city, unmarked, unnamed. No one came. No one knew. But a week later, a caretaker swore he heard something strange in the night. A low, trembling note that seemed to rise from the ground, soft but steady, like a heartbeat. He said it sounded like the Liberty Bell, only this time it was whole. Years became decades. The bell never rang again, but its silence became a sermon. Abolitionists marched beneath its image, freedom fighters carried its likeness, and black preachers in the South whispered its story to their children. They said the bell never rang because its song was not finished, because the world it was cast for had not yet arrived. And through wars and protests, through shackles broken and rebuilt, that idea lived on. Freedom, they said, was forged in silence, in the unseen hands of those history tried to erase. And one day, when every man and woman could truly claim liberty, the bell would ring, not in bronze, but in the hearts of those who never stopped believing. So if you ever stand before the Liberty Bell, look closely at that crack. Don't see it as damage. See it as truth. Because it is the reminder that freedom was not born perfect. It was born bleeding, forged by hands that were never free. And somewhere in that silence, the spirit of Elias still hums, softly, eternally, the song of the bell that never rang, but changed the world all the same.